another Village Talk. This is our last Village Talk for the year, actually. So I'm super excited to dive into workplace well-being. So tonight I am your host, Latanya Greaves. I am the mental health and trauma specialist of the Village. For those of you who may not know, I have a background in social work. I'm a master level social worker with an emphasis in trauma. And if you are new, the Village, we are a wellness organization for women of color to heal, expand, and to connect. So, what is a Village Talk? Tonight, we are hosting our Village Talk, which is hosted alongside various wellness practitioners. This is an exploration of wellness and self care through open and honest conversation. So, let me go through our rules, our house rules. This Village Talk will take about 1 hour long. So please feel free to use your chat to send in any questions that you may have. We also have polls to have some engagement between us because we do want to hear from you. In our chat tonight, we have Village co-founder Chanel. So please, if you see her typing in the chat, feel free to engage and interact with her. Near the end of our talk, we will dedicate about 5 to 10 minutes Q&A session at the end to answer any questions you may have. Tonight, I am glad to introduce the co-host, Avni Jain, who is a registered psychotherapist based in Toronto. So thank you again, Avni, for joining us tonight for our Village Talk on workplace wellness.
Hi.
Awesome.
Hey, nice
So,
to hear.
yes. So let's just, jump right into it, Avni. So can you please tell us about yourself and what prompted you to become a psychotherapist?
Yes. So, what prompted me to become a psychotherapist? Wow. When I think about what prompted me in this journey, I think about my journey here in terms of my education. I think back to my undergrad in psychology, where in my 4 years, I literally had maybe 3 courses that resonated with me. And I think back to those courses and I was like, wow, those really had an impact and really moved me into wanting to come into this field. And the reason why is because those courses really made me critically think about myself, really cultivated my own self awareness through understanding me and my world, my experiences, through whether it's my family of origin or learning myself through these theories that I was learning at that time. So I think what really prompted me to enter into this field was my curiosity in that and my development of my self awareness. And then having all these aha moments that I was calling my mom very frequently, saying, oh my gosh, I'm learning this about myself, and wanting to be able to allow others to have these aha moments. I was in my early 20s, or even just before I was 20, getting these aha moments. And I was like, this is so powerful and so impactful. And I'd love to be able to share this with others and get other people to start thinking about themselves and their experiences and their life, and how they all have patterns and connect to something. And yeah, that's kind of what brought me into the field. And now I'm so privileged to hear many of my clients' stories who come to me and share things that they've never shared with anybody before. That's a really big privilege.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So, of course, tonight we're talking all about workplace wellness, which is an area that you work in very closely. So, I just want to start off by defining, what does it mean to have a psychologically safe work environment? How do you define workplace wellness?
So when I think about workplace wellness, I think about safety. I think workplace wellness, workplace well-being is so interchangeable with safety. I think about myself when I felt safe in my work environments, what that felt like. I can imagine in some of these work environments where my opinions and thoughts really mattered, or I felt supported by managers and coworkers, or there was a huge emphasis on learning and feedback. There was job security, there was good pay equity, all these kind of things that would contribute to workplace wellness. And like you said, I do, psychological safety is a big part of that. And when we think about psychological safety, it's really the belief that it's okay to speak up with my concerns, my questions, make mistakes, and not be penalized for them. And so oftentimes I do believe that like psychologically safe environments really do contribute to wellness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, we spend almost 65% of our lives at work, right? So it's definitely very important that when we're there, we can have a psychologically safe environment. So thank you for sharing that. What are some ways that we can assess our work environment in order to determine, its impact on our well-being?
Um, when I think about assessing psychological safety in the workplace, I think it can sometimes be helpful to ask ourselves these questions, or ask yourself, do you feel comfortable in a team meeting to to ask about things you don't know or you don't understand, or do you generally try to maintain this image of knowing, right? Sometimes we get caught up with that. It would also be really helpful to ask yourselves, do you feel comfortable at teaming to raise difficult issues or concerns or reservations about a job task, the workplace culture, or team dynamic? Or do these sometimes happen more informally outside of these team meeting rooms? Um, I think about asking questions around what happens when mistakes happen or failures or critical incident arises in your workplace. How are those usually responded to? Are people's first reactions to isolate or distance themselves for fear of being blamed? Or do people come together for opportunities of learning? And lastly, when I think about assessing psychological safety, I would challenge you to ask yourself, how often do you have the opportunity to not only give feedback, but also receive feedback? Whether those from your peers, your colleagues, your managers, others you work with. Yeah, when I ask those questions, I really do think about psychological safety and assessing that for oneself.
Okay, no, that makes perfect sense. So really just this is something we can probably do every week or every day if we really wanted to, like while we are in our work environments, whether that is at home or, in person, to really just reflect on the way this space makes us feel or the way we react in different situations. Um, Awesome. I think those are great tips. At this time, I know we're early in the conversation, but I do want to launch a poll. And the poll question for tonight is, have you ever suffered from imposter syndrome at work? So I think we are all pretty familiar with this term because it has become very popularized recently. I know for myself, I definitely suffer from imposter syndrome. So right now I see 7 people have answered the poll. We're just going to give 30 more seconds for the final 2. Okay, perfect. So it looks like 100% says definitely they've suffered from this imposter syndrome. So you are clearly not alone, especially for myself. Sometimes it feels like, you're isolated and feeling this way, but I'm glad, well, not glad, but I'm glad that we all know that we're all going through the same thing, really and truly. So, Avni, can you tell us, oh, what exactly is imposter syndrome? I know as a Black Indigenous people of color, we are often, a visible minority at work. And it is also common to feel like an imposter or like you don't belong in the space that you're in. So can you just explain to us what exactly is imposter syndrome and what it is not?
Yeah. So imposter syndrome is this feeling like you're a fraud, that the idea that you've only succeeded due to luck, or for example, that I'm here because I'm a minority hire and not because of your talent or your qualifications. And so it's interesting because a lot of you guys had also related that you have all felt this in some way. And you're not alone in that, like Latanya has said, because research does show that over 70% of people experience these imposter feelings. And it does not discriminate from any which way. Men, women, medical students, managers, CEOs, actors, executives, they all experience imposter syndrome. And usually this surfaces when an accomplishment of some kind arises, whether that's getting an acceptance of a new job or a promotion, where people start to feel this self-doubt in their achievement. And alongside with that, these negative thoughts associated with that success that they've earned start to surface, which we often term cognitive distortions. Right. So, as much as the imposter syndrome is likely rooted in fear and anxiety, it's typically not based in objective facts. And so, you talked a bit about the BIPOC community, and for individuals specifically in spaces that sometimes we don't feel like we belong, this imposter feeling does usually arise more so. And yes, especially when we're one or few minorities in our team or in our workplaces, it can feel isolating at times. And we can definitely feel to doubt ourselves and why we're here and how we got here, despite all the evidence that show that we are skilled, we are competent, and we deserve to be here for sure.
Yeah, no, it's very, it's unfortunate that we, feel these things based off of, like you said, not really any concrete evidence, right? Because if we got the position, if we have the job, then we belong there and we should be able to take up the space that we are in comfortably. How could we best navigate these feelings of inferiority?
Mhm. I think right off the bat to acknowledge that we're all in this together, that we're not alone, knowing that this Paul and most of the people in this video have all felt these feelings before. I think it's important to remind ourselves that we're not alone, normalize these feelings for us, that this is something normal. It's also important to recognize that self-doubt in itself is normal for us to experience, right? And it's not about not experiencing these imposter feelings. It's really about how we respond to them. And so we don't really want to self-doubt to let it control our actions and our behaviors. And there are a few things that can help that we do have control over. And some of those include, how about observing our thought versus engaging in the thought, right? Engaging in a thought will allow it to spiral and really engage with that self-doubt versus just acknowledging it. Right now I feel really insecure, or I'm questioning things, right? Versus really actively engaging in that. And that's what kind of leads to that spiral. Sometimes it can be helpful to ask, is this thought helping me or hindering me? And what is the evidence for and against? And if the evidence shows that I was hired and I'm here for my skill and competence, then maybe what I'm really experiencing is a learning curve, right? I've just entered a new job. I just got this promotion. This is so new to me. Maybe I'm on a learning curve, right? And sometimes we don't give ourselves the benefit of the doubt to realize that, we're going to feel new and foreign in different capacities and different environments that we're in. We're likely on this curve. Another great option is I know for BIPOC individuals, sometimes mentorship in our work environments is very low. Having people who look like us and who've had a similar path to us is not always available. But if we do have a mentor outside of work, or even at work, or a trusted friend, oftentimes they can validate and normalize what we're feeling. And so that's really huge. It's so interesting because what makes the imposter feeling so powerful is that sometimes by talking about it, we run the risk of exposing ourselves as a fraud. However, if we can push through that and actually expose ourselves, we can help ourselves by showing us that we're not alone in that feeling.
I'm getting so excited inside just because you said that. Yeah, very often you don't want to say anything because you don't want to expose yourself or be, transparent. But just now we all exposed ourselves and we all said like, hey, 100% of the people in here, we've all experienced it. So imagine the people in your workplace. And I think you brought up a great point. If you have that one person at your workplace who you have that rapport with, where you can have open and honest dialogue, I think it is encouraging to be able to have that conversation so they can affirm you, hopefully in that moment and let you know, like, no, you're doing the best you can. So thank you so much. I love that.
And I think it goes back to the fact that we're trying to recognize that it's normal to have self-doubt, right? And I think the goal is not to never feel like an imposter. We're allowed to have imposter moments, but do we want a life ridden with this imposter feeling? Do we want it to be a barrier to us to moving forward or acknowledging our achievements and our successes? No, that's not helpful.
Absolutely. So, in your experience, Avni, what are some of the most common work related traumas that impact our well being as it relates to the workplace?
That's a tough question to answer because when I think of common work-related traumas, I'm thinking about very different people in different work environments. As I come to mind, I think about a nurse who works in palliative care who experiences a lot of death on a daily basis or a more frequent basis than others. Or I think about somebody working in a bank and having experienced robberies. And so I think when I think about common workplace, um, I do think that each workplace does come with their unique exposures to trauma. And outside of maybe stressful events or external threats that can elicit these traumatic experiences, there are also a number of organizational stresses that I also think show up in our workplaces that we sometimes brush off or we kind of minimize a little bit, but they do have harmful impacts to our mental health. And when I'm talking about organizational stressors, I think about like bullying, harassment, chronic pressures, toxic work cultures, high turnover in work environments, whether it's layoffs or terminations or conflicts within teams. And I think sometimes these organizational stressors can lead to traumatic experiences and impact on mental health.
Okay. Well, let's transition a little bit deeper into these traumas. I know for the BIPOC population, it is very common to experience, overt and covert microaggressions. Could you explain what those are and the impact that it may have on the mental well-being?
Mhm. So microaggressions are a covert form of prejudice. Microaggressions are everyday. We are defined definitely as everyday, subtle, sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional interactions or behaviors that communicate some sort of bias towards a historically marginalized group. So that's really what microaggressions are. Sometimes in the moment it might not seem like much and they can be easily brushed off, but the cumulative effect can be draining and impactful on our mental health. Microaggressions can be racist in its actions or thoughts or words. It can be homophobic, it can be sexist, it can cover a wide range around some of these implicit biases that come up. And some examples in the workplace can look like dismissing an individual who brings up race and culture in the work setting. It can sound like mispronouncing someone's name after repeated correction. It can be a fetishization or eroticization of a particular race or ethnicity. It can be polarizing cultural values or communication styles, like asking a Black or a Latina woman, why are you so loud or aggressive? It can be color blindness in the sense that I don't see color or all lives matter. And it can also sound like you're so articulate. You speak really good English, assuming that the person that you're addressing that to wasn't born here based on their ethnicity. And so I think it's really important to recognize that the difference between microaggressions and overt discrimination is that people who commit microaggressions might not even be aware of them, which doesn't excuse them from their racist, sexist, homophobic action or comment. But it's not necessary that you are a bad person because we're all human. It's not that you're a bad person. It's if you commit a microaggression, rather we need to be more aware of our own implicit biases and the impact that we have on people. And that really makes a difference. And sometimes that's where we need to be conscious of.
Yeah, absolutely. How would you suggest somebody becoming aware of these implicit biases?
Um, I think it's really helpful to have peers who you feel safe enough who can call you out or you can have these conversations with. And um, And yeah, I mean, it's interesting when we ask it from the point of view of like, how can we be aware of our implicit bias? There's a lot of actually tests that they do about implicit biases, even in the workplaces, that are really, really helpful to understand how sometimes our views or our perceptions can be skewed. So even these tests that I'm pretty sure they often do in workplaces, or you can do them online, that you get to answer a number of these questions and really assess and understand what those biases are. Some of them are ingrained culturally into us, right? We've learned these messages, we've been told these messages, and as much as we have had challenges or haven't been able to correct them, we've somehow developed these biases. They come out in certain ways. And I think it's important to recognize and be compassionate to ourselves when they come out, but also it's up to us to do our work and acknowledge that it's not fair. It does have an impact. And when even addressing them with individuals, which can be really challenging at times, because like I said, a lot of people don't even know that they're committing a microaggression. They might, sometimes calling them out might lead them to become defensive and make them unable to even recognize what their impact is or was. And so it can be really helpful to sometimes lean in with curiosity and even ask, but simply just saying, what did you mean by that? Right? Staying curious and compassionate can really give somebody an opportunity to be able to clarify themselves. Because microaggressions are so nuanced, so subtle, so entrenched and ingrained into our everyday kind of subtleties and these implicit biases, it's important that yes, we confront them and we take these tests or understand what these implicit biases are for ourselves and in our own families and our own spaces, safe spaces. But we're also curious and we're compassionate with others when we are wanting to call them out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm glad that you mentioned that sometimes people who commit these microaggressions, it may not be purposeful. It could be completely absent-mindedly. They may just be ignorant to the fact, or, it doesn't have to be purposeful. It could be completely accidental. But I'm glad you also brought up the idea of a name, that you could work with somebody for so long and not know how to pronounce their name correctly, although they've corrected you on multiple occasions. I know for me, I personally don't think my name is that complicated. However, I do have a coworker who every time they write my name, it is spelled incorrectly, faithfully, every single time. Now, it doesn't quite bother me, but it is like, okay, let's call you Peter, right? Like I took the time to know your name, Peter. Take the time, just take the time to know who the people are working with you. And that goes for, this is just me personally. When people have what people would consider complicated names, I guess, I want to tackle that. I want to know your name because it's a part of who you are. This is where you are from. This is a key part of your identity. So I take pride in being able to pronounce names correctly. I don't want to know your North American name. I want to know who you are at home, if that makes sense. You also mentioned a good way to navigate these conversations when faced with microaggression is to remain curious and keep in mind that everybody's human. Do you have any other tips on ways to navigate these conversations when faced with work-related traumas or microaggressions?
Yes. One, I think it's important to recognize that it's not okay still, right? It's still a traumatic experience, that even all these workplace traumas that we're talking about, that it's still not okay. In order to address some of these, I think it's important, one, to let's check ourselves, right? Check ourselves. Are we in a good mental health capacity? Are we choosing to want to engage in this conversation? Can we just ask some of those questions first? Oftentimes, it does fall on the BIPOC community to have to address these issues, and that can be emotionally and psychologically exhausting. I think it's important to recognize that what are our limits, right? We are human too, and we need to rest, and being able to have to challenge all of these and all of these capacities and all of these spaces or these safe spaces that we want to be in, that can be a lot and exhausting. So be aware of yourself and your mental health when choosing to engage in these conversations. On the other hand, if you are a person with privilege or and you can challenge a microaggression, go ahead, like fight that. Like let's let the more people, the better. If we can get other allies to call that out, I mean, that is fabulous. And we need all the power to you guys to help us mitigate some of this. It can also be helpful to ask ourselves, is this person worth while talking to about this, right? Is this someone I care about? Is this someone who I think might have the capacity to hear what I'm actually saying, right? Because like I said, oftentimes people don't know that they're falling into this and they can react very defensively. So it's important to manage our expectations as well when we're going into these conversations, right? We're not going to change everything overnight or a person's biases overnight. And so managing our expectations is really key, right? Thinking about what is actually going to be helpful about this conversation. What do I really want to instill? I want them to recognize that as much as their intention was well-intended and not malintended, they had an impact, right? And that's why leaning in with the curiosity, the compassion can really help another person, but also help you.
Yes.
Myself, help us, like help me or the person having this conversation manage our own kind of expectations, our stressors, our anger, our fear, our mental health, everything about that.
Yes, absolutely. I want to go into a chat question. So I have a question for those who are attending this talk tonight. What are some workplace boundaries that you've established to promote your well-being at work? So feel free to add that in the chat box. I can share one of mine actually. I realized in my previous job that I had a I was terrible at building boundaries. On my days off, I was still working. Or I would stay up late because I had a lot of paperwork to do. I would stay up all night till like 2, 3 in the morning just to get paperwork done. And it wasn't necessarily because I was behind. It was more so just I don't know, I really dedicated my time to work to the point where, and then I will read what the chat has over here, but to the point where my documentation was so pristine to the point where my boss was like, I love reading your documentation. I feel like I'm there with you. But then I looked at her documentation and it's like one word or one sentence. And I said, well, do I need to be doing all of this or would this be okay? And she's like, yeah, you just could put one sentence, but I love how you have these paragraphs of like stories and, descriptive words and whatever else. But I learned that I had to not that I wouldn't be as pristine in my documentation, but to just really schedule my time appropriately and dedicate the time to work that should be dedicated to work. And my time outside of work should be completely separate. I see here, Priyanka says, taking my 1 hour lunch. I never take lunch. I never take lunch. I took lunch for the first time on Monday. Oh, wow. I don't take calls before 9 a.m. Oh, that's really good. Don't take calls before 9. I used to work in a position where you were on call on certain days. However, I found myself taking calls every single day, even if I wasn't scheduled to. Let's see, not answering emails after 5 p.m. Thank you, Tamara. That's also a really great boundary to have. Obviously, I share boundaries that I don't have, but I've learned my lesson from that previous job, and I've actually begun to implement some of these. I don't put my emails on my phone. I cannot put my emails on my phone anymore because if I do, no matter the time, I would read it, I would scroll through it. I don't accept video calls unless previously notified. Absolutely. I'm bad at that.
I like that.
Yeah. I was off from work yesterday my boss called me at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I looked at it and I failed and I answered it. And I was like, I'm not working today. And he was like, oh, okay, sorry, I'll call you tomorrow. But you're aware. You know that I'm not working. So why are you calling me? But really and truly, people will take a mile if you allow them to. What are your thoughts, Avni?
Telling snaps to you for telling him like this is my off day. That's good.
What are your thoughts on boundaries?
Boundaries, well, I need to be constantly asserting my boundaries in my work environment, especially because this whole transition to work from home has really shifted and really made me think about, okay, what are my boundaries here? How do I work from home and protect all these other roles that I wear in this house and my hat that just is kind of encroaching my workspace, encroaching into the rest of my home environment. So I've definitely I recognize the importance of boundaries. I'm also not perfect at them and need to make sure that I'm on top of that. A lot of times when I think about boundaries, especially in the relation to this work from home, I've really started to recognize that when I started working from home, I I was completely exhausted. We've gotten into such a culture where we're now getting up and glued to our computer or on calls, and it's just that's not realistic. Before, when I thought about my work life before, I remember walking 30 minutes to work. I would listen to a podcast on the way there, or listen to my favorite playlist, and then get to work. I have a coffee ritual, work, and then in between my workday, I have these automatic routines that will come up with to protect those boundaries, whether it was to go get tea or the water station, or to engage with people in your vicinity, to have little chats. And so it was really hard to kind of recognize, working from home, what happened to all these breaks, what happened to all this time where I would have breaks essentially. And so it was really important for me to set the replicate that structure in a new way. And so for me, boundaries when working from home look like walks for breaks. So I need breaks, but the only way to force myself to get these breaks is to integrate walks. So I will go for a walk either before I start my workday or in between my workday, get out and just get some fresh air. Even if it's not a long walk, it's just around the block. Some boundaries that I implement on when I close my workday for the day, my laptop shuts off, and I usually on my work way home in the past, before this whole work from home, I call a friend on the way home and chat and kind of have that walk away. So I make sure when I turn my work laptop off, I call somebody, or while I'm prepping dinner, I'm chatting or I'm listening to my favorite music. And so protecting those work hours, that work time from the other areas of my life is really, really important. Otherwise, everything just gets encroached on and trotted on and all of that. And so, yeah, and it's important to also condition our work environments or our home environments, especially now that we're working from home. How do we condition our environment so that our moods and thoughts are conditioned as a result? So, do you have a space in your home that's just dedicated to work? Is your bedroom just dedicated for sleeping? Is your kitchen and your dining area just dedicated for eating? And I know that's a privilege sometimes. A lot of people are living in a lot more smaller spaces. Then how can you set limits in these areas? So when you're eating, let's say you work and eat at the same dining table. When you're eating, can you shut the laptop off? Can you close and move your work stuff off so you can eat? And so, yes, boundaries are especially important for me, especially during this transition to work from home, and trying to replicate the structure and the safety that I had before, that I had naturally, that was occurring in the office that I used to go to, that no longer exists now. We have to kind of train ourselves to implement those, which is a lot harder. But I love the taking, you said you take off your, did you say you take off your emails off your cell phone, or you don't respond?
I removed emails from my cell phone completely, and I do not, so I'm not aware until I log back in at 9 o'clock in the morning. That's when I'll see my emails. And once I leave, I will not see them until the following work day. because I realized in my previous job, again, I didn't have any boundaries. So if they sent me something, it could be 11 p.m. I'm looking at it, I'm responding to it. I just couldn't stop. So
I love that. If anybody here can take off their emails from their phone, if they can, that is just such a privilege. The work emails for sure.
yes. Um, so I know you congratulated me earlier on telling my boss yesterday, like, hey, it's my day off. Are you calling me? But communicating boundaries may be intimidating for a lot of people. Could you just give us some basic tips on how we can develop these skills?
Yes. So I think it's really helpful to acknowledge what boundaries are being encroached on, right? And so thinking about the spaces, the boundaries that you've set, or you want to communicate a boundary, what is being encroached on? Is it that you're working at home with your partner and he or she is dealing with renovations that are simultaneously happening during the workday, and they're constantly bombarding you and coming in to ask questions or ask for clarifications? Is that a boundary that's being encroached on, that's driving you nuts? Or is it the boss who keeps calling on your lunch breaks, your off days, and wanting to get to you? Like, I think it's important to really assess what that is. Or even in our work day, knowing that we've developed this culture where we're now on our computers and our phones and our laptops, that they can just email any point or chat us, and we're expected to respond right away. Whereas in the past, when in the offices, we weren't necessarily glued to our computer. We were moving, right? And so those responses weren't as immediate as now. We feel like we need to be making it as more timely and promptly, these responses. So I think it's important to, one, know what your boundaries are and what is being encroached on, right? And you will likely know this because you're going to get this feeling of anxiety or frustration, or this feeling of, like, for me, it's this tightness in my chest when I'm like, I can't breathe. And it's like, okay, what is happening here? Something is giving, or I'm feeling really anxious right now. And what is that boundary that is being encroached on me at this time? I think, two, it's important to recognize when that boundary is encroaching. So let's go with which one do you want to go with? Do you want to go the boss, the partner?
Um, the boss.
Okay, so the boss who's emailing like constantly, or like somehow during the day is just sending emails of priorities, or in our chat box trying to message us while we're trying to work. So maybe that boundary needs to be acknowledged. Okay, where are they coming from? Can we separate the intention from the impact, right? Can we recognize that they're likely very stressed, they have a number of things on their plate, and they're just trying to delegate, but that delegation is not necessarily helpful for us. It's not an excuse, but they're just trying to get things off their plate, and they're just sending things in our email inbox or chatting us on the chat that's coming up. And that's in turn making us feel really anxious and encroaching in our space and our work time and the priorities that we've listed for us in our day, right? And so it can be, one, helpful to know the intention versus the impact, right? What is that intention? Where can we acknowledge and validate that our boss might be stressed and dealing with their own stressors and just trying to get things off their plate and handle their day just like we are. And then if we're going to try and assert and deliver a boundary, I think it can be really helpful to start with that validation. I recognize that there's a lot going on with this project, and there's a lot of tasks that are happening or occurring, and you're needing to delegate those tasks as and when you get them. And then start with a feeling. However, when you email me 3 separate emails in a row, it makes me feel really anxious and flustered in terms of what is the priority, because I already have a set of priorities that I'm working on, and I'm unsure about where these fit into that, right? And then ask a request. Could it be helpful that we can set up just a call, right? Could it be helpful that I can just like send you a message and we can do a call for 15 minutes just to go over the list of things that you have, so I know how to fit it into my day? And so I think that can be really helpful in kind of, one, understanding what our boundaries are, where they're being encroached. 2, recognizing the intention versus the impact of that person, how they're encroaching our boundary, where are they coming from, right? 3, approaching them with validation first, acknowledging where they might be coming from, and then for asking, setting that boundary, right? So asking them, letting them know that when you do this, it makes me feel anxious. Can I just schedule a phone call so we can go over these priorities? Or can we set a standing meeting daily for 5-10 minutes? And if nothing's there, just so he can get things off or she can get things off their plate and I can prioritize my work day accordingly.
Okay.
Does that sound helpful? Is that like
110%?
good
Absolutely.
kind of communication strategy?
Absolutely. I think once you validate their own experience, then that kind of like lowers any defenses that may arise, because now they won't feel attacked. They won't feel like you are blaming them necessarily for feeling flustered or anything of that nature, but they will take it in a place of, they understand me. Now let me understand them. And how can we work together to build from this place? I love that. Thank you so much. Uh, at this time, I want to ask another chat question for everyone. Have you ever experienced burnout as a result of a job? And if so, how did it feel? And how did you navigate those feelings? So have you ever experienced burnout as a result of a job? As I mentioned earlier, I'm a master level social worker, so I've experienced burnout quite a bit, especially working with, I've worked previously with domestically abused clients, and it's heavy sometimes to receive all of the information, all of the stories. Is very, very heavy. And when you don't necessarily have a work environment that is psychologically safe, that will only lead to detriment to your mental health. And it will lead to burnout because you feel overwhelmed without having a safe space to get rid of those additional feelings. And unfortunately, it was my superior who was causing this unsafe space for me. So, on top of the burden of the emotions that come with speaking about domestic abuse, there was definitely the unsupportive factor from my superior as well. So, I know I've definitely felt burnout. For me, it feels like just no way out. It feels like a space of like you can't navigate anymore. Like you have no more to give. And that's unfortunate, especially when you are in a field where compassion is everything, empathy is everything. Um, yeah. But I want to hear from you guys. Tell us, have you ever experienced burnout? Yes or no? And if you did, what did it feel like and how were you able to navigate? I have a response here. Yes, definitely. I realized I couldn't pour from an empty cup. Yes, I needed to fill myself up. I took time to rest, take time for myself, and practice self-care rituals. The Village, we are all about self-care. Absolutely. Thank you, thank you, thank you for sharing. Let's see. How about you, Avni? Have you ever experienced burnout?
Yes, early on in my career, I think it was my second job or one of my first jobs. Um, I burnt out in a year. I was working in a similar field as you with women and children victims of violence, and also I was hired because I spoke another language. I speak Hindi, and a lot of my clients were people who look like me, from my ethnicity, from my background, and that was really hard um, job to do, seeing the violence, seeing these experiences, hearing their stories, and especially people who I identify with and I look similar to. And within a year, I burnt out and it felt exactly how you described it. And I I felt compassion fatigued. I felt burnt out. I felt exhausted. I didn't know where to go next. I needed to pause and take rest, like Pyle had mentioned. And I think that was really helpful to just take a step back and remove myself and before I proceeded further.
Absolutely. Ravina says, I put a lot of pressure on myself and made myself feel like it was my own fault for not being stronger or having more capacity to take on more work. Time off solves everything, brings perspective back into your life and refocus on what your actual priorities are. Oh, absolutely. To feel like it's your own fault, like you are not strong enough, like you should be stronger. And that is an absolute lie. You spoke about those cognitive distortions, things that we tell ourselves that are not really based on anything. And that right there is one of those distortions that we have to challenge because we are strong enough and we are doing the best that we can. Did you have more to add, Avni?
No, I'm echoing what you were saying.
Yeah. So of course, as we know, jobs aren't necessarily meant to be easy, right? But how would you describe normal work-related stressors and abnormal work-related stressors?
So when I think of normal work-related stresses, I think of, I'm not sure if this is normal, but I think of like healthy work stressors. I think of the stressors that give us enough anxiety to get the work that we need to get done, pushing out those deadlines, but it doesn't really linger or encroach in other areas of our life when we leave work. And then when I think about that threshold where it turns to become more unhealthy, I think about when it encroaches in our personal time, our personal space. We become overly exhausted. We have difficulties turning off from work. We are distracted even when we're with our loved ones or friends or family members, and we're not really engaged or connected in those other parts of our lives. And it becomes this whole suction of work stress.
I think that's a great way to explain it. When those stressors are no longer, a motivational factor, because we all need stress, right? Stress is a part of life. It helps us to get things and to accomplish things. However, when it starts to permeate through the other parts of our lives, then that is definitely a problem. Do you have any tips or exercises that we can implement throughout our day to help decompress, de-stress before work, during work, after work, anything like that?
I think there's so many tips, and I do believe that everyone has their own unique ways and practices of de-stressing, and even just some of the ones that people have mentioned on the chat as well, like even just taking pause, taking time to rest or reflect or engage in their own self-care practices. I think what's really helpful is to schedule it in. So if I could offer any tips, is that what de-stresses you. When you feel what helps after a stressful day of work or a stressful conversation or a difficult day or an encounter, whatever that might be. Those tools, what they are for you. But are we likely to schedule them in? Right? We schedule our work very well. We can schedule our work parties, our work deadlines. We can do all of that incredibly, but we oftentimes neglect the other areas of our lives. And so I think it's really helpful to carve out those times, whether it's for that walk or that virtual dinner that you want to get to, or today's chat that you guys all carved out, like whether it's taking this time or to cook or to meal prep or to read that book that you've been meaning to read or to have that bath, schedule it in, right? Just like you got to schedule in date night sometimes, you got to schedule in that bath, you got to schedule in that movie night. It can be really helpful to make sure we're carving out that time, because the days can go by so quickly and we forget, and work just takes over, and this assignment and then this deadline, but what about the other areas of our life?
Yeah. Chanel here in the chat, she says, I've been really into my diffuser as of late. A calming scent in my workspace helps me to calm down and focus. 100% agree with you. I have my lavender essential oil literally uncovered right here beside me. And it's like calming me down during my day and even right now during this talk. So I completely agree. That's right. Now it needs to pay me. Thank you.
There's something about scent though, especially when we turn on that nice smelling, whether it's the diffuser or a nice smelling candle or your essential oils, there is something about scents that really do have a capacity to self-soothe us.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean,
Um,
if you're not privy to scents, I know people who are very sensitive to scents, and it can be the complete opposite factor, like perfumes and all of that. But there are other self-soothing options, hopefully, for you.
yes, absolutely. I'm actually one of those people. I cannot deal with synthetic fragrances. I can only do essential oils or something like a little bit more mild and yeah. But continuing on, how would you actually define burnout? I know we all kind of shared and went into it, but how would you define it? Like, what are some ways to pinpoint burnout before it develops fully?
A good question. Burnout really is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive or prolonged stress. This could be job related, we're caregiving somebody. It could be related to any of those. Um, when we think about pinpointing some of these signs and symptoms, I think it's important to recognize the signs and symptoms of burnout. What are they? Right? Are you feeling more mentally lethargic, physically exhausted? Are you finding it difficult to get up to work? You want to have a desire to stay in bed all day. Your appetites change. You've somehow your lack in drive has kind of shifted. You're becoming more pessimistic or cynical at work. Oftentimes, you'll notice that by your colleagues, right? They may be telling you something. They may be saying, "Hey, you've been off lately," or "Are you okay?" Or you feel disconnected. I really think big part of burnout too that I notice is this withdrawn aspect, this disconnection from life, and oftentimes our everyday tasks and things get impacted by that. So I think it's really helpful to know what these signs and symptoms are for you in order to be able to enact on them, in order for you to be able to understand, okay, I am experiencing burnout. I'm heading down that path. Oftentimes we recognize we're heading down that path and we're panicking. We're like, I'm heading towards burnout, and we almost like freeze. Like, what do we do? And we allow it to kind of continue. What about if we stopped, we recognized, some people had just said, we took a break, we stepped back, or we talked to somebody about it, right? We reached out for help. We reached out to somebody, whether that's a therapist, your EAP, your a close friend, a loved one, a coworker, to just let them know that you're feeling what you're feeling. And it can be so helpful to just reach out, because when I said we withdraw, we disconnect, we isolate ourselves, we feel like we're so alone in this struggle and this pain. And as soon as we reach out and connect, we start realizing, whoa, there are other parts of myself that I've neglected.
Okay. Wow, Avni, you have shared so many great gems within this span of time. I really, really appreciate it for myself, for those who are joining, for those who will see later on YouTube. So our last question tonight, before we go into our Q&A portion, where everyone will be able to join the conversation and ask their burning questions. At what point should a person experiencing a psychologically unsafe work environment leave their job? When is it time to just throw in the towel and say, you know what, I need to go for my own well-being?
Eesh, that's a tough question. That's a tough question to answer, because leaving a job is never easy, and sometimes not even possible or not even an option for some people. So I think it would be really important to acknowledge that there's something about the work environment that you're struggling with. There's something there that you're either feeling unsafe about, or you're feeling threatened, or you're feeling that you need to get away from. And I think it's let's sit in that space first, right? Let's acknowledge, what is it about work? Where else do you have safe spaces if work is not a safe space? Right? Is home a safe space? Is there a person safe space? Can we confide in someone to let them know what we're thinking, what's going on? Right? If you maybe ending a job is not the only option. Maybe about talking to somebody and talking it out, whether through your EAP or a therapist or a friend or a loved one, you start realizing there's more options. right? That quitting may not be the only option, that maybe you can transfer departments. Maybe there's another job opening somewhere in a department that is available, or you have an opportunity to, or you know a manager there who might, you by asking to see what is available, can support you with that, right? Maybe there's options, especially with some of the psychologically safe elements we talked earlier. There's options that we can go to your union, or if you have a union or an HR, or create a grievance to be able to address some of these whether it's harassment or bullying or things that there are elements in this psychologically unsafe feeling that you're experiencing that need to be addressed, right? Or maybe it's about recognizing, okay, I don't like this job. I don't want to do it. I don't want to quit impulsively because I don't know financially I can do this, or I'm ready right now. Why not I work with somebody to talk about what that plan could look like, right? Maybe even seeing a therapist and talking to them about, like, this is how I'm feeling. Um, and they can support you with strategies, building your coping toolbox to be able to, one, tolerate the environment, the difficult environment that you're in for a short period of time until you know what your next steps are, whether that's transitioning into a new job or whether that's eventually quitting, but being able to have a plan around quitting, right? Sometimes it doesn't have to be so impulsive and so automatic like that, because we start realizing after we make these impulsive decisions or we quit a job, we start feeling regret and we start feeling very unsafe and panicking about it. Maybe it doesn't have to be that way. Maybe we can take our time to be able to get to that decision, and in the meantime develop some tools to manage what you're in right now. Also to feel validated and heard that your psychologically unsafe environment is unsafe, right? Sometimes we need to be hearing that we're not crazy, we're not thinking wrong, that these things that are happening to me in my work environment are a product of me, or it's my fault, and that it is a product of the environment and what's happening. So not really answering your question, how to make leaving your work, how to do that, but I hope that kind of helps in terms of some ideas.
Absolutely, and even if it does come down to making a plan for the next step, so it's not impulsive, so you're not regretful, I think that's absolutely answering the question and very, very helpful. So thank you again. At this time, we have our Q&A session. So does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask Avni as we have her here with us before we go ahead and close for the evening and for the year? It's funny, when I started this new position that I'm in, I actually had a superior who would yell at me. And I've never had a superior raise their voice at me, to the point where I was in absolute shock. I didn't see it coming. I was just like, did this person just like raise their voice at me, for lack of a better word, yell? And afterwards, I really just like sat and reflected, because it wasn't a situation where I had done anything that was necessarily wrong. And I was very new. I was on that learning curve, trying to acclimate to my new environment. And I was just met with like this
aggression. That's
thankfully, I can say, and I told myself, I said, okay, if it happens again, I'm going to communicate my boundaries with them and let them know, like, this is not going to be appropriate. It did happen a second time. I was in complete shock again. I was shocked to the point where I was frozen. Like, I'm a grown person, you are an adult as well, and you are comfortable enough to raise your voice at me. Thankfully, after those 2 times, it never happened again. Or if it does start to happen, they would catch themselves and they would apologize quickly. But it's definitely been very interesting. So Ravina here has
response to freeze is normal as well, right? When
yeah.
we're experiencing a threat, we have the fight, flight, and freeze response, and the freeze response does happen. And yeah, it's more coming from a place of shock and what is happening.
Yeah, confusion. Ravina here says, do you have any tips or advice for confronting coworkers or managers specifically about microaggressions? Sometimes I feel like if I confront in the workplace, it will hurt me professionally. Racial microaggressions, to be specific. I've been in that position before as well. What are your thoughts, Avni?
Um, like I said earlier, I think it's important to one, ask yourself and check yourself, is this a conversation that I want to have? Will I be heard and listened? Right? Is this, do, are they aware of their intention versus their impact? Right? Could we approach it from a different angle, or kind of going in with that curiosity and that compassion and starting with, what did you actually mean by that? Right? Maybe starting off there, asking, giving them the opportunity to clarify, because like we said, microaggressions are some so subtle that they're sometimes not intentional. And yes, it doesn't take away from the impact that they're having, but leaning in with a bit of curiosity first. And I get that sense that you said, you're wondering if it will hurt you professionally. I think it's scary to have difficult conversations, or any sort of conversations like this in general, when we can be mindful of our approach and how we regulate ourselves, and coming in with that compassion, that curiosity. It's likely that someone's going to feel like it's an attack. I said earlier about managing some of our expectations when we're going to go in to have these conversations, understanding that for some people they can feel defensive because they don't really know what they're saying or how that had impacted somebody. So expecting that, and also recognizing, managing your expectations of what you're hoping for, right? What are you looking for here? Are you just looking for them to acknowledge that that had an impact? Or are you looking for big change, that they will change some of that implicit bias overnight? Be mindful of managing some of these expectations with the person that you're thinking of approaching. It can be helpful to also, what else? So something else that came to mind, I completely went away. But likely, if you're sensing these microaggressions, you're likely not alone in that. Are there others in your environment, in your group, that are also, or have heard this, or are feeling this? And maybe not, maybe you are alone in that. Maybe it sometimes can be helpful to talk through that with a colleague, someone who you feel safe with, before you confront another coworker about it. Is that helpful, Ravina? Is there something a little bit maybe more specific that I can?
Yes, that was helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Avni, for taking this time to be with us to speak about workplace well-being. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight for this great conversation. So where can we find you, Avni, on Instagram? Let us know. We'll put it in the chat box as well.
Yes, my Instagram handle is my.therapist.avni. You can follow me there, or you can find me at avnijain.ca.
Awesome. And as far as the Villij Talk is concerned, you can find our past episodes on YouTube. We will put the link below as well. And if you found tonight's conversation valuable, we encourage you to donate to support the Villij Fund, helping keep these conversations and experiences accessible to the community. So we're going to put that there as well. Support the Villij Fund at www.thevillij.com/donate. And of course, we have candles. We have brand new candles in stock. So please look over and see what we have there to help, create some rest, some feng shui. I actually have a Villij candle right here. This is one of our previous ones. Can you see it? Yeah, sis, take care. So this one of our old editions. So take a look at what we have in stock. Your self-care candle. And again, thank you for joining us tonight. This wraps up our Villij Talk for this season. So happy holidays, everyone. Happy New Year. And I hope to see you again next year.